You know the one thing that you can't do? It's putting a verbal minefield in front of Jordan Peterson and expecting him to trample on over it. And I think we just saw evidence of that when Jordan found himself cornered between two feminists who used every trick in the book to paint him as something that he is certainly not. There's a lot to talk about here, but watch this clip before we get into it.
Just for clarity, do you think a trans woman is a real woman?
I don't really like the way those questions are formulated. I don't know what that means. What do you mean a real woman?
Well, I'm asking you, in your mind, it depends what you think a real woman is, but do you think a trans woman is a woman?
No.
Why not?
Because I think that women are capable, generally speaking, of having babies, and they have female genitalia, and they have an XX chromosome, and I think the biological markers are relevant. It doesn't necessarily mean that I don't think that people should be treated with respect and dignity if they happen not to fit easily into a gender category. That's a different issue.
Right.
But it's a matter of definition, and I actually think it's a foolish argument in some sense, because what do you mean by real?
I mean, you've just clarified that, though. You don't think that a trans woman is a woman. And do you think that that is what is behind or explains your opposition to this idea of a law mandating you to use a preferred pronoun?
That's not my argument at all.
Really?
Yeah, really. My argument is that the government shouldn't compel voluntary speech.
No, but I know what your argument is, and you've made it very clearly.
But that's exactly it.
There's no motivation behind it. But you don't believe a trans woman is a woman?
I wouldn't put everything online in my life to take the stance I did unless I had thought that through very deeply. And I've thought it through very deeply. There aren't hidden motivations that have to do with some arbitrary prejudice against trans people.
Okay.
It's pure and simply this. There's never been a time in English common law history where the government compelled speech, and the Canadian government dared to do that. And that was unacceptable. And they masked it with this show of compassion for the oppressed, and I don't buy it.
Right, but you would, as I think you said, at an individual level, if somebody asked you to use a particular pronoun, you would do so.
Well, I have.
You have? Right.
Yes.
Let's talk about feminism. Are you a feminist?
No, not as it's currently defined, certainly not.
No, well, in any other definition?
Well, I think that anybody who doesn't think that the competitive landscape should be opened up for equality of opportunity is not thinking. And so everyone's interests are better served if people have as equal access to opportunity to display their talents and to manifest their talents in the world as possible. So in that sense, certainly. But feminism now, and this is why it's so deeply unpopular, a very small minority of women in the UK identify as feminists. And the reason for that is it's primarily become an ideological weapon. And it's an ideology that I detest, actually, the ideology that it's associated with, collectivist ideology.
Right. I mean, okay, and that's your view about feminism. Aisha, are you a feminist?
Oh, absolutely. I'm a very proud feminist. I'm very, very proud of being a feminist, hence my pink dress.
Oh, well.
If you look at when Jordan Peterson really came to public light in the wake of his opposition to Bill C-16, I think that gives us a clue for why he became such an enigma online after 2016. It was around 7 years ago that the #MeToo movement across the world resulted in a kind of feminist resurgence, while paradoxically, the transgender movement gained traction to practically erase the gender binary in the first place. Seen in this context, do you understand why Jordan would almost be hesitant to go along with the presuppositions in this host's questions? What does feminism even mean now? What does equality even look like? And even more importantly, does the word woman even have a precise definition left? If you've watched Jordan Peterson from his earliest days, and even if you look before that with his recorded university lectures, he was slightly more comfortable engaging with what I sometimes call container words. These are terms like religion, nationalism, and feminism that hold inside them many unanswered questions. But Jordan has now become a lot more wary of using these words flippantly. That's why it irks him when someone that identifies with or throws around these container words in conversation like they're nothing. I think that's why when this host straight up asked if Jordan believes trans women are women, it is impossible to answer that without the context of modern society where practically anyone can raise their hand up and claim to be a woman on the basis of gender identity. Why would you even engage with a word that doesn't mean anything anymore? The only way to make sense of a postmodern culture is to use that same weapon against them. And in the case of Jordan Peterson, his constant calls to clarify what you mean underneath those container words isn't an embrace of postmodern ideas, but a revolt against them using their own tactics. Now imagine this. You live in a culture where every word and category gets thrown in the air and is up for grabs for anyone that wants to claim them. And then on top of that, you've got governments wanting to force you to use the words they want. The two of those ideas combined constitute the biggest threat to free speech in society that has existed in recent times. On the face of it, a bill like C-16, which has already been passed by the way, only makes preferred gender pronouns part of the Human Rights Code of Canada. But here's an idea of the dangerous and outlandish precedent it sets on compelled speech. Never in the entire history of British common law do you find even a single example of compelled speech legislation, even stretching back all the way to the Middle Ages. Sure, you've got words in every culture you're morally obliged not to use, but that's a whole different matter to a government telling you words that you have to use. And it's incredible that an authoritarian overreach like this would actually be coming from the left on the pretext of compassion rather than a stultified right-wing power looking to cement its control. In the modern world, that's a veiled threat you always need to guard against, and that's only done when people regain a moral and intellectual conviction in themselves. I think in the last 8 years, Jordan Peterson has been the single most powerful force in inspiring people to do exactly that.
You would like men to regain or reclaim their strength physically, mentally and morally. Is that broadly correct?
I would say morally, fundamentally, but I think the other things go along with that.
Right, and if that
but it isn't men precisely who I'm speaking to. It's people. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm actually interested in individuals. Fundamental news that's important about what I'm doing isn't the political element. And the people who talk to me don't talk politically. They say they've watched my lectures.
But part of it is that I think for a lot of people the kind of personal does become the political.
Or the political becomes the personal.
Yeah, and I think in terms of in
this situation, a lot of people are wrong because primarily what's happening is people are watching my lectures, and as a consequence, their lives are improving dramatically.
Oh, I'm sure they are. I'm sure people are have had a huge conversion after, and they're much happier once they've been.
It's not a conversion.
But what I would like to do is kind of almost. I think at the moment the discussion about feminism is very divisive, and sometimes it can sort of be like, okay, men have to lose and women have to gain. Actually, everybody has a lot to gain by greater equality. Now, whether you get the equality of outcome that you want, I think only time will tell. But certainly, equality of opportunity is very important. And actually,
we can agree on that.
And a lot of men would benefit from that. So I think a lot of men are having a lot of crises at the moment in terms of mental health, suicide issues, their own sense of identity. Because I think some of the stereotypes put on men are quite limiting for them as well. I think they make men quite unhappy as well.
The devil's in the details with regards to equality, because I'm an advocate of equality of opportunity, but I think the idea outcomes, that's an appalling doctrine.
Why? All right. Well,
because you have to produce an unbelievably potent bureaucracy to make the ever greater and ever finer distinctions that are necessary to enforce equality of outcome. How many group differences are you going to equalize across? Is it just gender and sex? How many genders?
No, so
gender and ethnicity? How many genders?
I think
how many ethnicities? How many races?
We are in very early stages. It's only 100 years since women got the vote in this country. We have had a long established patriarchal society and set up for a long time in the world in this country. So I think we have a long way to go to see where it plays out. There is no country in the world where we really do have gender equality properly yet in terms of real decision making and real
some of the
power.
Scandinavian countries maybe?
They're still not quite there, and I think you've spoken a lot about this. There's still a way to go in Scandinavia.
You see, one of the things that's happened in the analysis of the differences between men and women is that the social constructionist claim is that the differences are socially constructed, right? Is that it's a consequence of environment that men and women differ. But what the scientific literature indicates is that as cultures become more egalitarian, like they have in Scandinavia, the differences between men and women actually increase rather than decreasing, which is a direct repost to the social constructionist view. So they just deny all that. The biggest differences in the world in interest and temperament are between Scandinavian men and women. It's exactly the opposite of what everyone predicted.
I actually don't get this modern obsession with equality, because if you scratch the surface, why would you care if someone had more if you had enough? The best that we as a society can do is make sure that we're all equal on the starting line of life, even if we don't reach the finish line together. And it's almost impossible to do even that because there will always be unique personal and environmental circumstances, challenges and advantages that set you apart from every other individual. If you look at when this host asked almost in a confused manner why equality of outcome is a bad idea, that was a moment that revealed just how ill-informed she truly was on what this equalist idea has led to in human history. When you snap out of the hypnosis of this version of equality, you start to see modern third-wave feminism in a very different light. Because here's the deal, any idea that claims to work to advance women's causes or uplift them in society does not automatically become a feminist idea. Feminism as an ideology has its own interpretation of history, its own inspirations in left-wing philosophy, and its own prescriptions on how the world should be. A truly pro-women position would advocate for removing as many barriers to female success and choice as possible, and when that's your goal, men become an ally rather than an obstacle. And you do away with a lot of resentment that comes from being fixated on a warped notion of being equal at the finish line. Jordan Peterson has been trying to hammer this point home for a long time, drawing data from the Scandinavian countries that have gone farthest in the world in creating an equal playing field for men and women. Left to their own devices, men and women in Scandinavia on average make different choices in their career and family. And that is where different outcomes result from. When you realize this statistical fact, the only option you're left with to equalize men and women is to trample on their different choices, which is the first step to tyranny as history shows. It's been said about human society that if you try to bend it too far, it breaks. And the sheer amount of power and centralization needed to bend society around ideologies almost always ends badly. For someone like Jordan Peterson, who's been studying totalitarian regimes for over 4 decades, this understanding of human nature at the back of his mind always makes him stop short of bending society around ideologies, whether it be feminism, communism, or any other new ism. I think this interview demonstrated to him how many people are still naive to this fact, even though there is ample evidence for it in the atrocities of the past century.